Harris's 15-minute speech in the House when he introduced the bill on the 4th of October last, it was very telling that the words baby, child, unborn and mother were not used even once, not once. That tells us how much concern this legislation has for children in the womb, or indeed for any concept of motherhood or family. I firmly believe that the referendum decision and the introduction of this legislation are decisions which will be rued by future generations, but that is a debate for another day. I want to turn briefly to what is at the heart of this bill, and it is truly frightening. The bill defines termination of pregnancy as a medical procedure which is intended to end the life of a fetus. That is worth repeating. Intended to end the life of a fetus. It is very telling that on an issue so laden with euphemism, that no other word or form of words could be found to diminish or minimise the sheer gravity of this statement. This legislation does exactly what it says on the tin. It ends the lives of unborn children. It is a situation beyond tears. So this has ceased to be something which the Minister and the Government feel they have to gloss over. It is now worn on their sleeves. It is something they are proud of. But even extreme pro-choice campaigners are embarrassed by just how stark that statement is. At committee and report stages in the Dáil, they put down amendments which tried to tone down the language, removing the reference to the ending of life and replacing it with the usual language of healthcare and so forth. Those amendments were rejected, and so the brutal reality of this bill, the ending of life, is plain for all to see, written in black and white. This bill is the first piece of legislation to be brought before the Oireachtas with the specific aim of authorising the ending of life since the Public Safety Acts of the 1920s and 30s, which authorised the imposition of the death penalty. And now, over 90 years later, the ending of life is again before this House, only this time it is packaged as healthcare. It is a strange world indeed, where healthcare involves legislating for the deliberate ending of innocent human life, as this bill does. Can the Minister please address this and answer that question directly? But of course, what other healthcare involves ending a life? Can he point to any other piece of healthcare legislation on the statute book that talks about the ending of life of something or someone? I would be very interested to hear a specific answer on that point. But of course the Minister isn't even here. This Shannon debate is seen as a tidying up event, another example of what Hannah Arendt referred to when she talked about the banality of evil. The fact is that ending of the life of any human being is seen as some great advance, and that it should be seen as some great advance in human rights or healthcare. This is grotesque in the extreme. Under this legislation, abortions are to be carried out entirely at the expense of the taxpayer. The long title of the bill says that it aims, quote, to make available without charge certain services to women for the purpose of termination of pregnancy. The grotesque figure of €12 million has been put aside in the recent budget for the introduction of these services. Abortion is an elective procedure. That is to say, in virtually all cases, it is a procedure which is optional and not medically indicated or urgently needed to save a life. Perhaps the Minister can also answer this question. What other elective procedures are performed entirely at the expense of the state and taxpayers in all cases? I certainly can't think of any. Representatives of the Irish College of General Practitioners and the Institute of Gynaecologists and Obstetricians were asked this same question at the recent Oireachtas Health Committee hearings on the 19th of September last, and they could not identify another elective procedure which was funded entirely by the taxpayer. Can the Minister please address this point? Why is abortion, and only abortion, to be the only elective procedure funded entirely by the state? How can this be justified when other elective procedures will still be paid for by the person receiving the treatment, that is, if they can endure lengthy waiting lists? After decades of talking about universal health care, free at the point of treatment, we have finally achieved it, but only for the provision of abortion. What a shameful day for the Irish Health Service. The issue of freedom of conscience was brought into sharp focus by the EGM of the Irish College of General Practitioners last weekend, which was convened to discuss the bill. Always a man for a good soundbite, Minister Harris has dismissed the doctor's concerns and was quoted last weekend as saying the law on abortion is changing, the law on conscientious objection is not changing. But any rational analysis of this bill shows that that is simply not the case. As the law stands, if a woman presents at her GP to request an abortion, that GP can inform her that he or she will not take part in such a procedure, and at that point the GP's legal obligations end. Under this bill, however, if the same GP refuses to carry out the termination, a new legal obligation is placed on them to refer the mother and her baby to another GP in order for that doctor to terminate the life of the baby. So by definition, Cathaoirleach, the law on conscientious objection is being changed, despite the ministerial Orwellian doublespeak. Whereas today a doctor can freely and in accordance with his or her conscience refuse to facilitate a termination of pregnancy in any way, shape or form because they believe it is not medicine, because they believe it is not good for mother and baby in their best clinical and ethical judgment, from this day this new law comes into force, they will be forced to facilitate a termination as a third party. It is doublespeak of the most nonsensical kind and objectionable kind for the Minister to suggest that such a fundamental change in law is not a change in the law at all. And as well as looking at what is in the bill, we also need to address what is not in the bill. The Government could have included provisions to address a number of serious concerns expressed by voters, including a large number of those who voted yes. For example, there is no provision in the bill to protect children who may be targeted in the womb as a result of being diagnosed with Down syndrome and other genetic conditions where that occurs within the 12-week period when no reason has to be given. Cathaoirleach, this bill brings about the appalling vista whereby a pregnancy which is entirely wanted by its parents ends up being unwanted and aborted solely as a result of screening tests which shows the baby may have Down syndrome or on the basis of the gender of the child. How can that be right? Minister Harris speaks about compassion and humane treatment, but where is the compassion and the humanity in making it perfectly legal for babies who are unwanted solely because of a genetic disability to have their lives ended? Minister Harris wrote in the Irish Independent the day before the referendum that, quote, "We've specifically excluded disability for grounds for abortion in this legislation." I heard his former party colleague Deputy Peter Fitzpatrick mention last week that the Fine Gael head office produced a graphic for Twitter during the campaign which stated, and I quote, "Termination on grounds of disability is prohibited." So the Minister says this is specifically excluded and Fine Gael says it is prohibited. But can the Minister please tell me where in the bill is it specifically excluded or prohibited? The lawyers in the House will tell us that for a piece of legislation to specifically exclude or prohibit something, there must be explicit language in the legislation which excludes or prohibits it. No such language exists in the bill. Can the Minister please point it out to me if I am wrong? What was that I said about Orwell? And can he also explain why, if both he and his party favour such an exclusion or prohibition, they opposed amendments to that effect in the Dáil? I look forward to addressing these issues and many others at later stages of our consideration of this legislation. Recent opinion poll research gives us a clue as to why the Government is in such a hurry to pass this legislation. A poll conducted by Amárach recently shows very strong opposition to core aspects of the legislation. Amárach found that just 30% of the electorate support abortion being funded by taxpayers, compared to 44% against. They found that 68% support the right of conscientious objection for doctors, full conscientious objection, not to participation in abortions, compared to just 17% against. Cathaoirleach, with opinion polls showing such a huge level of public opposition to the main proposals in the bill, is it any wonder that the Minister wants to dismiss these amendments and ram the whole thing through as quickly as possible before a general election, whenever that takes place? With such huge opposition to the more extreme and heartless aspects of this bill, I don't blame Minister Harris for not wanting to engage. Sorry, I understand why Minister Harris for not wanting to engage with others on them, with voters on them. It would be wrong of me to say that I don't blame him. At report stage in the Dáil, the details of this opinion poll were referred to during a debate on an amendment relating to the use of ultrasound, which the poll found strong public support for. Minister Harris responded with what I thought was a very revealing comment. He said, "We hear a lot about opinion polls, Amárach being one, but we had a really big one where people went out and voted in the referendum in May. People made their decision in respect of this." Cathaoirleach, in the referendum, people were given a binary question. Did they want to repeal the 8th Amendment and give the Oireachtas power to legislate, yes or no? The use of ultrasound or the freedom of conscience of doctors or the abortion of disabled children and so on, none of these issues were on the ballot paper in May. And yet the Minister is now using the referendum result, which merely gave the responsibility to the Oireachtas to decide how to regulate abortion in this state, conservatively or permissively as they saw fit, to justify rejecting even thinking about any of these humanising amendments. He is ignoring amendments on the basis of this flimsy justification and, in fact, shutting down discussion on these issues. Essentially, he interprets the referendum result as giving him a carte blanche to legislation in any manner he sees fit. But how can this be right, particularly when 34% voted no and when so many yes voters had serious concerns? This is just the latest in a long line of recent examples of referenda being used and abused to justify populist grandstanding by our political class and this government in particular, but to do so at the expense of innocent unborn children, to do so in a way that sets its face against any ideas that abortion, even were it to be legal, is something to be regretted, something that we should try and build public policy so that people choose differently. None of that seems to be permitted anymore as a class of right-on politicians try the ultimate Orwellian stunt of trying to turn abortion into some kind of social good, which it can never be for the children who lose their lives, or indeed for many, many of the women who do suffer, despite the denials, despite the refusal to engage with discussion about abortion regret, despite the cynicism shown in the Dáil to real-life examples of where women spoke about their abortion regret, despite the ridiculing that had occurred that people had survived abortions indeed and gone on to live. Despite all the negativity, the ridicule, there is a truth here. And the truth is that innocent human life is lost. Adult life is wounded. This is a bad day. It's certainly what I would regard as one of the saddest days in these houses in recent years. People have given themselves, and the politicians here want to create some notion of a right to choose that completely disregards an innocent, invisible but no less human creature. I hope and believe that there will be a better day when we will find a way to heal the breaches that have been created here in this destructive law which sets men and women against each other, which sets mothers and children against each other, which sets its face against finding a better and a more humane way to deal with crisis pregnancy and to protect all of the human beings involved. Gormagat.